Well, hello, and welcome to this LawFest presentation about the use of law to promote adaptation to the impacts of climate change, with a particular focus in this session on the impacts on coastal Australia and coastal communities. This is a companion presentation to the one dealing with bushfire impacts of climate change. My name's Jan McDonald. I'm a Professor of Environmental Law at the University of Tasmania Law School, and this is an area that I've been working on for many years now. I think it's a really fascinating topic, and I hope that you enjoy it and it gives you some ideas for future reflection. Here's what I'm going to cover in this short presentation. I'll just briefly outline the types of coastal hazards to which many communities are going to be exposed both now and in the coming decades in a worsened scenario under sea level rise predictions. I'll then outline for you the broad categories of adaptation options or response options that governments and communities are already grappling with across Australia and indeed internationally. And then in the final two subsections, I want to talk about the way in which we might implement those strategies through our planning law systems in Australia, and also some compensation and liability issues that might arise. That's something that I know lots of people find really interesting. And so we'll finish on that with some final reflections about why this area of law has proven to be quite difficult for governments to make progress on. So one of the reasons why this is such an important issue here in Australia is that we are a coastal nation. 80% of all Australians live within 50 kilometres of our coastline, and about half of the population lives within 10 kilometres of the coastline. So what happens to our coasts really significantly affects economic activity, it affects our social activities, it affects where we live, where we work, and where we play. We are already subject to many coastal hazards. You can see from this image that we have problems of erosion when we have storm surges and highly erosive storm waves. We have coastal cliff instability, where in many parts of the country you have cliffs that can suddenly shear away. You can have inundation from the ocean coming into low-lying parts of coastal communities. But at the same time, you can also have significant problems with estuarine flooding, where rivers that are coming out into the river mouth and hitting the ocean experience flooding during periods of heavy rain. So we've already got about 40,000 houses or homes in Australia that are located within only 100 metres of soft erodible shorelines. We have a very, very significant economic problem going forward with issues of shoreline erosion in Australia. And that's only going to be worse when we have a look at what the projections are for future sea level rise. You can see here, this is a graph that's from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 6th assessment report that was released it wasn't the 6th assessment report, it was the Oceans and Cryosphere report from 2018. And it shows that by 2100, now that's only 80 years from now, on a worst case scenario, we're likely to see 2.4 metres of sea level rise. On a best case scenario, with the largest amount of emissions reduction and with the largest amount of other factors reducing risk, we're still likely to see 0.5 of a metre of sea level rise by the end of this century. And that's really significant because the risks that I've just outlined for you, the ones relating to erosion and inundation, are not so much problems where you simply have what we call a bathtub effect, where the sea level just increases by 50 centimetres. It's what happens when that gets multiplied by storm surges or cyclones or other heavy rainfall events that magnify those impacts way beyond just the 50 centimetres of average sea level rise. So the rule of thumb in coastal management is that for every 1 metre of sea level rise that you might have, there will be 100 metres of shoreline recession. So the coast will retreat inland 100 metres for every 1 metre of sea level rise. What that means is that even on a best case scenario of 50 centimetres of sea level rise over the next 80 years, we're going to lose, on average around Australia, 50 metres of current coastal community. Think about when you walk around Hobart or when you walk around Launceston or other parts of the country that are subject to some kinds of intertidal or tidal processes and ocean processes. How far back 50 metres goes? There's a lot of infrastructure and construction in that 50 metre zone. And on the best case scenario, that land will be underwater or simply won't exist because it will have been eroded away in the next 50 to 80 years. The other thing to bear in mind is that sea level rise is not going to happen evenly across the country. This is a map of where we're already observing higher rates of sea level rise, even around the Australian coast. So in the Gulf of Carpentaria, we're seeing far higher rates of sea level rise. And even off the northwest tip of Tasmania, we're seeing higher levels of sea level rise than the rest of the country. So we've got multiple challenges here, but the direction is only happening, the trend is only taking place in one direction, and that's really something very important to take into account. And what it means is that we have to start thinking about how we're going to adapt our coastal communities to these future changes and to the ways in which sea level rise is going to exacerbate existing problems. There are 4 broad approaches that have been identified. The first is simply to avoid vulnerable locations where we still have natural values along our coastal landscapes. We should not develop them further and place more people and more infrastructure at risk. So avoidance, by identifying future areas where we simply don't do anything, we don't put new people there, we don't put new communities there, is the preferred strategy where it's available. But of course, in Sydney, in Melbourne, in Brisbane, in Perth, avoidance is really no longer an option. In Adelaide, avoidance is no longer an option. We have these incredibly exposed coastal communities. And so for those coastal areas, there are 3 effective alternatives. One is that we learn to live with sea level rise as much as possible. In areas that are going to be subject to more frequent flooding, for example, we might think about changing the design of low-level buildings so that wherever possible, we either raise them or we change the way that we use ground floor areas. So they're not carpeted, they're more able to be evacuated more easily. Accommodation of both individual buildings, but also the types of use to which we apply certain buildings is a way of dealing with these changing conditions, but still being in those areas. The prevailing approach in Australia so far has been to protect and defend, to build seawalls, to sandbag, to fortify our coastlines as much as possible, or to do replenishment of sand and revegetation of our coastal dunes. This is in recognition of the fact that there's a huge amount of infrastructure already in place and we can't just let it fall into the ocean. The most radical strategy that we might start to consider in the future is retreat, where we actually recognize that there are some properties and some places that simply can no longer be defended, and we have to think about absolutely withdrawing from those areas, abandoning or relocating properties. So those are the 4 options. Some of them can be used together. So you might decide that over 50 years, you're going to start retreating from an area. But in the meantime, what you're going to try and do is just accommodate the existing coastal hazards. Now that's an option that will work for a lot of different places. But again, when you've got millions and millions of dollars worth of property located very close to the beach, and I'm thinking here along the Queensland coast with the high rises along the Gold Coast, it may well be for as long as most policymakers think about it, the plan is to continue to protect and defend. If the worst projections of sea level rise continue, there will be a point at which it's no longer possible to successfully protect and defend, and that's really a challenge for the future. The difficulty with all of these adaptation strategies is that they all involve trade-offs or externalities. A decision to do one thing will have some kind of adverse impact on some other strategy or some other group of people. So, for example, hard defences like seawalls have the effect of scouring the beach in front of the seawall. The sand, the wave hits the seawall and it drags the sand back out to sea. And so what you have there is a significant loss of beach access and a loss of beach amenity. You can see in this picture here, this is a photograph that I took a few years ago off the New South Wales coast at Byron Bay. And you can see that there's a seawall in the background, which is rocks. And what they've done is they've had a scouring effect on the piece of land that I'm standing on that's now been sandbagged. And where the seawall was located, the land was still intact, but what it did was it caused a sort of a scouring surge to essentially wash away the adjacent bit of land, which then had to be subject to this emergency sandbagging protection. So a seawall can have really significant effects on biodiversity. It can affect beach access, and you can see here evidence of severe coastal erosion actually restricting beach access. You can also see the way in which a hard protection structure like the rock wall that you can see on the left, the way it has eroded the adjacent land that didn't have any seawall and which ended up necessitating emergency sandbagging. So there's always trade-offs. If you put in a seawall, it's going to have adverse impacts. If you don't put in a seawall, it's going to have adverse impacts. Keeping existing protection structures is going to have its own set of costs. And you can see this is the northern Sydney beaches, the Coleroy-Narrabeen area. And I think what's really interesting here is that if you look towards the back of this picture, you can see one property hasn't experienced the erosion and it's got rocks in front of it. But all of these properties in the foreground didn't have protective rock structures, and you can see what happened to them after this very, very severe erosion event. It's high stakes with so much real estate and so much development along Australia's coast. It's really a very significant challenge. And it gives rise to a whole range of law and governance issues around who makes these trade-offs, who manages the trade-offs and the community's perceptions of them. It's much easier to plan for adapting to the impacts of climate change in respect of future development, land that has not yet been developed. That's much easier than trying to retrofit or decide how we manage impacts on existing areas. We're challenged by the fact that the regime that governs these issues is very fragmented. It's fragmented both from state to state across Australia. We don't have a national coastal adaptation law. But it's also fragmented within each jurisdiction, because a lot of the time planning law is a matter of local level planning decisions. But you also have a range of different areas of the law that are implicated. It might be planning law, there might be some coastal management, there might be some biodiversity conservation. So it becomes very messy. And there have been many calls for greater national coordination and national leadership. At the very least, there should be strong state level leadership. But at present, there's a practice of state governments. They tend to devolve a lot of these difficult decisions to local governments, but local governments certainly don't have the money or the resources to get the modelling done about exactly what the risks are to their coastal communities and how they need to respond to those risks. So let's look briefly now at how we might implement some of these response strategies through our state planning systems and our local planning systems. Well, we can think about avoidance and accommodation options by the dominant model, which is to identify areas that are vulnerable to current and future erosion, and to map those in our planning frameworks and our planning schemes. And what you then do is you say, those are areas that are too hazard prone, and we're not going to allow significant development in those areas unless it's very small scale development that's capable of being removed in a short time frame. So you map, you identify high risk areas, and then you restrict or outright prohibit further development of those areas. The difficulty with that is that unless that's already public land, what you're essentially doing is taking away someone's property values. They're expecting that they can build their house or build their new suburban development on that piece of coastal land. And so it's very difficult for councils to make that very bold decision to restrict further development. What often happens is that development is allowed, but it's subject to rules about how far back you have to build, the way that building has to happen. Does it have to be raised up? Do you need to make provision for certain events, allow for certain flood levels, and so on? That's generally the approach that's taken in respect of new development. But in some parts of the country, even that has been the subject of litigation and court challenges. Let me take you to Lakes Entrance in Victoria, where the local council has been keen to encourage new development. It's a seaside resort. You can see that it's got quite a spectacular long beach line here, but I hope that this photo shows you just how precarious this community is when you think about the fact that it's got a very, very low-lying coastal spit that could very easily be eroded, and it will then expose that sort of slightly inland coastal community to the sort of the ravages of coastal processes. And it's really quite a challenging location. And I'll take you back to a case that was decided about 10 years ago now, which was an action brought by somebody who wished to develop a parcel of land, brought against the Shire Council. The council had approved a proposed development that was designed to be above the projected flood and inundation levels. So the developer had designed this block of land, had designed the development so that everything sat above all of the projections for sea level rise. Despite this, the local community were very concerned about impacts of climate change in this area. They were concerned that even though this development complied, what would eventually happen was that in the absence of the council actually putting in place more strategic planning, this development would just be like a little island literally in the sea because other things wouldn't have been protected. And so they challenged the approval in the Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal. The tribunal upheld that challenge and overturned the council's approval of this development. They decided that simply protecting this individual development was not enough if the whole area was going to become unlivable because underground sewerage, water supply, electricity was going to get inundated or washed away. And that what was really needed was a comprehensive council-level planning framework. What's really interesting here is what the court says about these longer-term impacts. It says, from the current understanding of the impacts to lake entrance, without intervention, this development will be subject to conditions that may well lead it to being unviable for occupation. And the resultant economic cost would be to those future owners and quite possibly to the wider community as well. And it's neither fair nor equitable to see this as a balanced outcome for intergenerational equity. This is a really great example of how the courts are starting to take into consideration these challenges of what we do about future development. So let's think about how we might think through options for existing development using our planning law instruments and what we have available to us within existing planning law frameworks. There are some options. We can avoid further exposure. If we've got little rundown shacks in an area, we could decide, well, we're not going to allow somebody to knock that shack down and build an apartment block because that would expose even more people and even more property to further coastal hazards. So we can avoid further exposure by refusing redevelopment or intensification of uses. We can require that buildings get retrofitted or modified. That doesn't happen very often, but we do have some precedents for it. For example, in the 1990s, most Australian jurisdictions required people who had swimming pools to install pool fences. That wasn't a requirement before then. It was something that the laws, a new obligation that the laws imposed upon people. We could undertake a program of constructing seawalls to protect and defend existing infrastructure, or we could, through our planning system, allow private landowners to undertake their own defences. That would be good in terms of the public not having to pay for those things. But on the other hand, if one person does it and the rest of that beachfront community doesn't, that will have adverse externalities or consequences for those adjoining landowners. Or we could set up a framework that implements a staged retreat or relocation, which might involve mandatory resumption by the government of people's land, where you have to, forced buybacks, for example. So far, Australia hasn't done that at all. There's nowhere where we've done that kind of forced acquisition of people's private property. And it's certainly not a very attractive option because, as you can imagine, beachfront property is pretty valuable, but it's still something that is being actively considered in some high-risk areas. So some really difficult questions that local governments and state governments continue to grapple with around the country are, when is each one of these options appropriate? Over what time scale should we be thinking about each one of those strategies? Should we build a seawall that's going to cost a few $1 million now, but which will not work? It won't be successful in protecting properties in 10 years from now because of sea level rise. How do we decide on those timescales? In which circumstances should one option be required rather than simply encouraged as a matter of public policy? And very importantly, each one of these strategies is going to have a cost associated with it. So who decides who's going to pay for each one of these options? They're very difficult questions. Some of them are legal questions and some of them are policy questions. And it's a very interesting space because those questions are so blurred. Let me just highlight to you that it's not completely out of the question that for some of Australia's highly urbanised areas, the big cities, that we do pursue a stronger campaign of protection and defence. This is something that is already being used around the world. These are the Thames barrier gates that protect London, which are not likely to protect it very well if current projections are accurate and if they don't do something to improve the technology that they've used. But the Netherlands has got a very significant program of protection and defence because of its unique geography and topography. So there are lots of different mechanisms that are being used there. And in Australia, as I said, we do have some experience of protection and defence here, but it is incomplete and doesn't always work. So hard defences are being considered. Let me just show you. This area along the Narrabeen Beach in northern Sydney is now being subject to a seawall development, which is being largely subsidised by the state government. That will have a certain lifespan though, and we can't expect it to last up to the sea level rise projections of 2100. Closer to home, some of you would recognise this seawall at Long Beach, Nutgrove Beach at Sandy Bay, Lower Sandy Bay. And I think you can already see from this photo that although it's effectively protecting the land from being eroded, there are definitely times when in high storms and high tides, it doesn't necessarily provide the same level of protection as we might want. Kingborough Council is protecting certain parts of its coastline. This is Conyngham Beach, and there are real challenges along that coastline. Clarence Council is also trying to work out what it's going to do along Roaches Beach and Lauderdale Beach, because there's been significant problems with erosion over many years. And you can see a range of different options here. There's sand replenishment, there's revegetation of the coastal foredune, and there's also some rebuilt seawalls as well. So a mixture of different approaches. So Tasmania is already grappling with a lot of these coastal hazards and trying to work out what's going to endure over the longer term. There are really challenging questions when we start thinking about retreating or relocating from some of these areas. When is it going to be appropriate to actually say everyone has to leave? That's not an easy decision to make. Is there a way of forcing relocation without doing it through the law by simply saying once we can't access underground services like water and sewerage, an area is no longer livable for human communities? Who's going to fund the retreat options? Where are the people who are having to move? Where do they go? Do they just lose their homes and all of the value that's associated with those homes? How are we going to manage that as a society? We do have some models that we could look to, but they're not really telling us exactly what the preferable strategy should be. Finally, all of these decisions are exposing local government and others to concerns about whether they're going to be sued in the future in respect of the decisions they take now. And so I would just like to pose the questions to you. Should anyone be held liable for a local government restricting future development rights by saying, look, this area is too hazardous, it's going to get eroded or flooded in the future, we really can't allow you to build there? Should anyone be able to sue for that? Or is it just, one of the costs of climate change? Should anyone be able to sue a local government for having suffered property damage as a consequence of severe weather events, either because the council hasn't built a seawall, or because they built it and didn't do a very good job of it, or because they allowed the development to go ahead in the first place. We haven't actually had any of those questions litigated in Australia so far. And so the circumstances in which liability should be imposed on a local government or on a property developer really haven't been tested. I think that a key question is going to be, at the time that a local government decided to do what it did, was that a reasonable course of action? And so approving a very significant coastal development in a highly vulnerable area 40 years ago might have been a lot more reasonable than it is in 2020, knowing what we know now. I think that that question of vulnerability and exposure and liability is something that's really interesting. New South Wales is the only state in the country that has special protections for local government. They are immune from liability by virtue of a special provision of the Local Government Act, provided they act in good faith in coastal management, or indeed bushfire management or floodplain management. And so that gives them a little bit of protection from that liability and exposure. So let me summarise very briefly. The amount of sea level rise that we're likely to experience globally and in Australia is highly uncertain, but we know that we're going to see higher sea levels in the future, and that is going to exacerbate existing coastal hazards that we're already having to grapple with. We also know that although lots of planning time horizons are limited to 2100, sea levels are going to continue to rise well beyond that time. The risks relate to not only just the gradual rise, the bathtub effect of sea level rise, but also the way in which sea level rise will interact with other extreme events. So it will interact with severe coastal storms to make the storm surge and the erosive force of waves even more dangerous and more damaging. We face a problem in Australia with a very fragmented and inconsistent planning approach across the country. There are very different approaches taken in Queensland, New South Wales, Tasmania to the problem of coastal hazards. And even within jurisdictions, within New South Wales, within Tasmania, you see different approaches from one local government area to another. Lots of states have kind of passed the buck from state government down to local government, and poor old local government really faces difficulties because it doesn't have a huge amount of resources to do the science, to know what the real risks are. There are very significant risks associated with not doing a good job of long-term planning, but for local government, there's also risks of limiting development because they're worried that they might be sued for not allowing developers to get the full value of their land. So far in Australia, private property rights have prevailed over public interest considerations. So we've tended to allow seawalls to be built. We've allowed, in fact, we've actually funded publicly the protection of private beachfront property through seawalls. We've allowed people to continue to build on their property. But there are significant risks of long-term liability if we continue to go down that path when we know that sea level rise is going to continue into the future. They're really difficult questions. Some of it is a legal question, but a lot of it is just a broader policy question that society has to grapple with. And so I think that that will make a really interesting topic for you to investigate further. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions and answering them when we have an opportunity to meet online.